David Martin, I am so happy to finally be able to interview you and connect with you in this way and get some of your ideas about how to create heaven on earth, because I think you've given this a lot of thought.
I have indeed.
Yes. Okay. So let's jump in first and tell me about you and how you came to be doing what you're doing now. You've had a very interesting background, and I recall that you grew up in some kind of a fundamentalist community, and I really am curious how you give us the story.
Well, I inelegantly described the community that I grew up in as the Mennonite Taliban, which
that has a certain image,
which I'm sure will offend both equally. So, what I mean by that is that in truth, my parents and my genealogy, as I shared with a number of people, has been in the Anabaptist tradition, in the Reformation, in the Swiss German Reformation, back since the 16th century.
What does that mean?
So what that means is that most of us are familiar with the headline Reformation, which was the Reformation between the Lutherans and the Catholics, or the Church of England and the Catholics, depending on what part of Europe you were in. There was a different Reformation that was happening as well, which was referred to by most historians as the Anabaptist Reformation. And what that was a group of people who fundamentally saw the notion of what is being taught in the Gospels as a means by which you removed intermediation and you removed hierarchy from the relationship people have with the divine. So, from a simplest description of what this group was, they rejected infant baptism, which, while the argument theologically was that you should wait till you're an adult to figure out what you believe, which has some inherent logic to it.
Yeah.
The real counterculture message was that by not being in baptism records, you weren't in tax records. And so, while it's always been sugarcoated by the church to be this beautiful story of, people who wanted children to make adult faith decisions, which is true to a degree, but there was also an anti-establishment bent to the group that actually knew that by not being in baptismal records, you were also not in conscription records, you were not in tax records, you were not in a lot of other things, which actually served a bit of a anarchist bent in the community. So there's part of it. The other piece of the tradition was a absolute commitment to pacifism and nonviolence. And that obviously stood in the way of what was going on in Europe during that period, because obviously conscription into military service was part and parcel of living in Europe in the 16th and 17th century. So the idea that you would actually have by fiat a decision made by a community of faith that said that they weren't going to be involved in nonviolence, that was another kind of thumb in the eye of the establishment. And so while most people are familiar with the Lutheran or the Anglican Reformation, very few people have an appreciation of the Anabaptist Reformation. And so it was out of that in the early part of the 18th century, my ancestor David Martin came to the port of Philadelphia and got a land grant from William Penn's son and settled what is now the fertile fields of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania.
Oh, wow.
The tragedy is in the 1970s, when we moved from Southern California back to that, which is my father's ancestral homeland, what was a faith-based community that was defined by its living to the dictum, be in the world but not of the world, adopted a very tragic transformation. And my family has a whole lot to do with it. My lineage has a lot to do with it. But a decision was made that there needed to be an active suppression of the movement of, just the way society was moving. And so a counterculture extremism was embraced. And when I refer to the Mennonite Taliban, that's what I'm talking about. It was making a point of rejecting what society was doing, not because of a belief in a thing, but for a reflexive response to say, if society's going left, we go right. If society's going right, we go left. And it was not creative. It was not generative. It was reflexive.
Yeah,
And anytime
reactive,
and anytime you mix, faith and God language behind reflexes, you've got a human problem, because when your actions are determined by what you're not, you are actually not living, either a faith or a religion. You're actually living a reflex, and that's the world I grew up in. So I was indoctrinated into a world in which right at all costs was kind of celebrated. And then I met and encountered throughout my entire life a world where I kept seeing nuance, and nuance is not welcome when you live in a world of right.
So how did you begin to move out and away from this kind of indoctrination?
Well, I think early on, the comedy of it was self-evident. I let people know that some of the early paradoxes in my little brain were in the early 1970s. We spent a lot of time doing peace marches, marching against the Vietnam War. And I always found it fascinating that we could march for, hours down at the San Diego Naval Base and, do the chants, what do we want? Peace. And when do we want it now? And somewhere around 2 or 3 in the afternoon, women could start taking their bras off and flashing their breasts at naval seamen. And I was, as a little boy, kind of going, I'm not sure that that's really having the effect that it's supposed to have. I don't think they're necessarily feeling bad about being part of the naval operation when they get that afternoon show. So I'm missing something in my little brain. And then, I would get home and I would see that my parents would have no problem using physical violence to discipline us. And I thought that was very ironic that we would march against a war in Vietnam and we would march against the use of force. But the only way the church could understand discipline of a child was to actually use extreme physical harm. And I remember having that thought very early. In fact, I have very vivid memories of having very severe physical punishment being meted out on my little body, and kind of just puzzling it. Didn't we just protest violence? Like, wasn't that a weird thing? Yeah. So the funny thing is, Nori, I don't think I ever fit in. So my nonconformity probably started with asking questions that I was not invited to ask very early on. By the time I was 11, it became very clear I was not welcome in my community.
Wow.
And so while we were in part of a tradition that did not practice what we would consider to be kind of classic excommunication, certainly the effect was nothing less. And it was probably, through that journey
how did that show up, this excommunication simulation, shall we say?
Well, so the way it shows up is I have had a life that I never have tried to fully explain, because I can't, because I don't know what makes my experience distinct from other people's experience. So I try not to explain it in a lot of polarities, but what I try to say is that I have perceived things in an unusual way for my entire life. Mm-hmm. And when you perceive things and you're a small child, your linguistics are fairly simple. So I would very conveniently and very simply say, I see something, or I sense something, or I hear something. Now, objectively, another person in the room might not have had a visual cue that matched my statement of seeing, or they might not have had an acoustic cue that matched my, my hearing. And the fact that I chose those words made people concerned that I was living in some sort of alternative reality. And in a religious environment, the alternative realities are unambiguously evil.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things that was fascinating is I never knew that what I was experiencing and how I perceived reality was that distinct from how others did. But I was repeatedly reminded of, you can't see what you saw, you can't hear what you heard, you can't know what you know. And when you're told you cannot do a thing, that you quite literally just manifest. One of my favorite examples was telling my father in a campground in California that his father had passed. And my father going, well, no, I mean, you know, we're up in the woods, you can't know that. And as I was being, kind of chastised for pointing it out, a park ranger came up with a phone call saying that they were trying to locate my dad and tell him that his father had passed. Now,
Wow.
my experience was I had actually had what I would say was a communion with the spirit of my grandfather. I had been very aware that he had passed, but the fact that I knew it in a way that I wasn't supposed to sanction, be able to know a thing, because you only know a thing when it is officially delivered to you by a sheriff. I knew it and I talked about it, and that was not acceptable.
Interesting. So you were tuned in a way that other people weren't tuned in, I assume.
Yeah.
And you were picking up information they didn't see, and so you were essentially, cast out as not being following the community code.
Yeah, exactly. And I use a very simple, for me, it's a beautiful, playful metaphor because it's the best way I can describe it. If you think back to AM and FM radios, and they had the dials on the thing, and you had the little thing that went up and down the dial, and your FM stations were 88 something to 108 something. I've often said I just had a radio that didn't have the upper and lower limits. I could hear stuff at the other ends. And I play with that metaphor because it is, in fact, the best description I have. When people say, well, how did you know so much about coronavirus? Well, because I've been watching frequencies no one else was watching. Because I was, observing things nobody else was observing. And, at certain points in time, that's been quite fashionable, and people have exploited that for their advantage. But the same people really despise it when they're trying to cover up a story, and I'm also able to see the cover up. So, I mean, the bad news is that that having that open amplitude of awareness, which is the best way I can describe it, is viewed by some as an exploitable asset, viewed by many others as a terrifying thing, because people wonder what I know that I'm not saying.
Yeah.
And so there's this interesting bounded extreme where, ironically, what has just been, for me, just as simple as breathing, is often viewed as something that is the basis for very painful separation and distinction.
How interesting. So how did that lead you now into doing the kind of work you've been doing? Excuse me. Maybe you could start by describing the work you're currently doing, and then tell us how this set of this ability to pick up the extremes of the spectrum enabled you to come and do the work that you're doing now, which is really quite unusual work.
Yeah. So I think once again, a metaphoric expression might be that I have tried to normalize alchemy. By that, I mean that we had in our religious upbringing this mandate to turn swords into plowshares. And very early in my life, professionally, what I was doing in graduate school, and then what I wound up doing when I started the clinical research program at the University of Virginia Medical School in the early 90s, was find defense technologies in countries that were treaty restricted from exporting offensive military technology. Now, a little bit of history. During the Reagan administration, you'll remember that there was a very interesting series of scandals around way overpriced toilet seats on Navy submarines and military procurement that had clearly lost touch with reality. And so during the Reagan administration, a decision was made to make commercial off-the-shelf procurement something that was a standard for the Defense Department. And what that meant was that where the treaties that ended the Second World War, which were treaties that prohibited places like Germany and Japan and parts of Eastern Europe from exporting offensive military technology, when the definition of what military technology changed to mean everything from bombs and guns and bullets to toilet seats, when that change happened, the treaties actually restricted the trade of very interesting technologies out of many of the places that were, in fact, on the losing end of the Second World War. And so one of the things that I was doing was going into places like Japan, like Russia, like Germany, like other parts of Europe, going into military installations on behalf of requests made by the US government, finding technologies of interest and finding civilian ways to deploy them. So a very simple example, gamma cameras that were used to detect nuclear testing during the 70s and 1980s, I was able to help transfer into companies that started using them for radio tracers in medical procedures. So now any interventional cardiologist is now using a technology, or any breast detection that is using a radio tracer isotope to detect breast cancer. Any one of those technologies that are in use today come courtesy of the Cold War and come courtesy of the work that I did to take defense technologies and civilianize them. And whether it's antenna, whether it's the way we shape reflectivity of radio frequencies, literally, if you have an electronic device, somewhere along the line between 1989 and 1996, there's a high probability that I touched something in everything that you currently use. And the reason for that is I had a very unique ability to look at a thing and see it for what it wasn't, but what its essence could be. And I want to say that again, see a thing for what it wasn't, but what its essence could be. So my view of the world has always been that I look at a thing and I try not to be tricked by the reflective, objective reality. In other words, when I see a thing, my default mode of consideration is that which I'm seeing, probably everybody else is seeing, which means that which its essence is probably what I'd find interesting. So how do you move through the reflected properties of a thing to really understand its essence? And the fact that I was able to commercialize and industrialize that process, which led, by the way, in the mid 1990s here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, to the very first cabinet level position called the Secretary of Technology, where we developed a platform which was called the Uniform Technology Transfer Standards, which essentially institutionalized the alchemy of looking at a thing for its essence rather than its reflected properties, so that you could think about the lateral transfer of technology. And most of it as just a matter of course, and this is because most of our expenditures in R&D are primarily for defense applications. an enormous amount of my work was literally swords into plowshares, was literally taking military technologies and finding civilian application. So it's no surprise that in 1998, when I founded MCAM, which is the company that I am currently chairman and CEO of, and when I founded that in 1998, what I had built by that time was a global system to do exactly that, which was to underwrite the intangible assets of the world through the lens of what else could be done with the thing that somebody said was the solution for X. And I was finding all of the alternative uses, which gave rise to the company that, now I've stewarded for the last 24 years. So
a question here is, when you say you underwrite,
yes,
explain what you mean here. Are you
beautiful.
That's get movies out into the economy as
it rolls out in a number of ways. Under the United States Constitution affords only one property right to citizens. The property right is defined under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which is the property right of intellectual property. That is the only property right that's granted by the Constitution of the United States. Now, intellectual property is patents and copyrights and trademarks and things that we can manifest out of our creative impulses. And it's important to realize that that was so important to the framers of the Constitution that it is the only property right granted to anyone by the Constitution. That's a pretty big deal. But here's where it gets problematic. In the 1930s, when the banking reform happened, we started introducing the concept of what was called a general intangible lien. What a general intangible lien was the ability to say that if you as a debtor had an inability to pay your debts, one remedy was that the banks could take your creative works. They could take your creative arts. They could take your patents. They could take your know-how. And the reason was, going back to, ironically, one of the most famous bankruptcies that no one talks about, which is the bankruptcy of the White Star Line after the Titanic disaster. The White Star Line was the shipping company that owned the Titanic. Wow. And in that bankruptcy, it turns out that the value was not in the ships. The value was in the intellectual property, the patents. There were more patents, by the way, per capita on the Titanic than there are on the space shuttle.
Wait a minute, when you say more patents on the Titanic, do you mean that the people who were aboard the Titanic who lost their lives?
No, I'm talking about the actual technology in the Titanic.
Okay.
So the amazing thing is the camshaft, which is ubiquitous to every internal combustion engine, was first trialed on the Titanic. The way you actually do that kind of interesting, taking a compressed production of energy and turning it into a rotary force, a whole bunch of really cool technologies. The first wireless communication systems were on board the Titanic. These amazing innovations that were all throughout, the ubiquity of the next 30 years, all on board the Titanic. And so the brilliance of realizing that the value of innovation often far exceeded the physical value of assets.
Interesting.
But here's the problem. The problem is, up until the formation of my company in 1998, no bank could actually look through that set of assets and ascribe a value to it. And so what my company did, and when we talk about underwriting, what we did was we would literally look at a portfolio of intangible assets held by a person or a company, and we would put a purchase offer to the bank, which said, if in the instance of a default and foreclosure, these assets need to be claimed by the bank, we are actually going to guarantee their purchase price. And by doing that, the banks could now lend money to companies that didn't have tangible collateral.
Oh, interesting.
So we actually innovated a way to take the ubiquitous property right afforded every citizen and finally allow it to count in banking.
That's
From
amazing.
1933 to 1998, it was impossible. And from 1998 on, we were the ones that emancipated human innovation to actually enter the banking system.
This is extraordinary, David. I had no idea really that that was what your company was and you were doing. That's brilliant.
Well, and you know, once again, what I would say is, and this is the fun thing, I really didn't do anything. I brought visibility to the essence of a thing.
Yeah.
It was always there, right?
Yeah.
I didn't make intellectual property. Well, I did. I got a bunch of patents, but I didn't make intellectual property happen. What I did was I found the essence of it. And more importantly, my commitment was to democratize the access to capital, which because of these laws could not access capital, because obviously if you didn't have independent wealth when you were born, if you weren't born into, you know, entitlement, and if you didn't sell your soul to private equity or venture capital, you couldn't get a thing off the ground. Well, now what I did was I actually brought the banking world and the innovation world together so that we could actually lower the cost of capital and increase the liquidity of innovation in the US and ultimately in 186 countries, which is how many we operate in now. So
wow. So how have you ever calculated how much money you have enabled different individuals and companies to raise through this procedure?
Well, what we do know is that we, in the latter part of the 2000s, we had a very early calculation of that, where we actually ran a calculator, kind of like the international debt clock. We ran a calculator on our website, and we pulled that off at over $2 trillion.
Wow.
So well over 2 trillion.
More than lunch money.
You know, a lot more than lunch money. And the great news is, through a process that was called the Global Innovation Commons, which was the probably the greatest innovation we ever did as a company, which was the establishment of a platform, an open source platform, which allowed countries to access patents that had not been filed within their jurisdictions, so that they could actually use state-of-the-art innovations without infringing on the proprietary rights inside of other jurisdictions.
So you mean they could take patents that had been acquired in other countries, but not in their country, and they could apply for the patent in their country?
Well, not apply for the patent, but use the technology and use it in the open source. And so this was stimulated by a very interesting conversation that I had in India, where I was sitting next to the Minister of Science and Technology on the right after, by the way, the Supreme Court had made a mandate that potable water should be a human right. India, by the way, one of the few countries in the world that actually has made that an official statement, which I think is indicative of our absence of humanity a lot of places. But the Indian Supreme Court said that potable water should be a human right. Minister of Science and Technology was sitting next to me at a dinner, and he said, I don't know how we're going to solve this problem. We have 800 million people who can't get clean water. And I said, well, give me 2 weeks. And he said, what do you mean, give me 2 weeks? And I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to pull every water purification technology patent since 1789, every one of them. And I'm going to build an open source repository called Water for India. That open source repository will be every diagram of every deployable water filtration system that has ever been made by any human being. And I'm going to make it available to everybody in India for free. And Water for India was launched 10 days later. I beat my 2 weeks by 4 days. 10 days later, we launched Water for India, and reportedly over 200 million people have potable water courtesy of that exercise.
Wow, that
fantastic. Became the basis for what became over a $2 trillion initiative that we did on clean water. We did it on carbon alternative energy. We did it on appropriate agriculture technologies, particularly erosion management and environmental management of farmland. We did it on response to any human crisis. So we did one on response to tsunamis, tsunami warning systems in places that couldn't afford the kind of state-of-the-art tsunami warning systems. We did it on the suppression of toxic dust in Eastern Europe when a lot of the mining and refining facilities were exposed to drought conditions and it aerosolized toxins into the air. We did it on stabilizing sand dunes. We did it on all kinds of things. But over the course of the next decade, we had several thousand companies started around the world on open source technologies that came out of the Global Innovation Commons. And without question, the emancipation of that information was probably one of the greatest human accomplishments that I and my company were able to pull off. And it was just a phenomenal experience to realize that we have within our grasp everything we need the minute we emancipate ourselves from the illusion of scarcity.
So that is a wonderful segue into how are we going to create heaven on earth? And how do you at this time with your, I will say, spidey senses that are sort of off the normal range of human sensitivities, how do you see emancipating the human beings from viewing things as scarce? Because I'm with you. I view the universe as, let me just mention a story here. You may already know it, but it's an Einstein story. And toward the end of his life, he was allegedly asked by a reporter if he had any questions he'd been thinking about that he hadn't yet shared in his public lectures. Yeah. And he apparently lit up at the question and he said, oh yes, there's one. Is the universe a friendly place? Because if it is a friendly place, then 99% of everything we're doing is wasted effort. And I say it is a friendly place, and I'm hearing you say it's a friendly place, but we haven't really made that connection.
Well, I mean, true to my ancestral roots, and now I'm not talking about my direct ancestors, I'm talking about my legacy ancestors. I think I'm the heretic of the next Reformation.
It's an honor to speak with you. I think that's another one.
So I think we are quite literally, and I think the current events are just theater for what is in fact the Grand Inquisition of the Dark Ages and the emergence of a new enlightenment. And I say that because of the following. The theory that drives pandemic scarcity and the theory that drives radical interventions of locking people down and closing businesses and doing all kinds of other things is a theory that's born of two very insidious faith statements. The faith statement number one is that the world is finite, scarce, and needs to manage scarcity. So every model that we have, every business that we have is in fact the friction coefficient of managing scarcity. And that's part of the dogma. The second part of the dogma is that we fear death. And those two things become the sacred catechism of a worldview that says that the world is not abundant, the universe is not abundant, it's out to get you, and your job is to manage pushing back the tide of darkness against this certainty that you are going to die and go wanting. So that's the dogma that drives most of what we call modern civilization. And by the way, put religion in there, put commerce in there, put anything in there, and most of it lives in a model that says fear death and manage scarcity, but manage scarcity through friction. And that's an important thing because friction is how many inefficiencies can I put into a supply chain so that I can extract through this parasitic thing we call commerce. I can extract my fee and then the next person extracts their fee and the next person extracts their fee. So we've built an economy on frictional management of scarcity, which is very fascinating. And that's one worldview. And that's without question the worldview that the World Economic Forum now has promoted as, kind of the grand reset is going to be, now we are going to centrally manage scarcity. Okay, guess what? Scarcity is an illusion. Managing it is an illusion, and friction within an illusion is an illusion too. So the great news is they can have their story, and that's fine. There's another narrative, and another narrative is actually the narrative that objectively manifests itself every day, which is the universe has three attributes. The universe is persistent, it's generative, and it's infinitely orthogonal. And I'm going to unpack those three words. Persistent is actually once what we talked about when we talked about the difference between the production, say, of a well or a spring, where it flowed. And when we talked about a failure in that world, what we talked about is something we counted on that for some reason was interrupted. Failure wasn't a negative thing. It was the absence of the reliance on a thing.
Yeah.
And that's how the word used to be used. A crop would fail, a spring would fail, a river would fail, a flood would fail. When we talked about it in that means, what we were saying was that there was a system we counted on, and the thing we counted on was interrupted for a moment.
But it was
That's, by the way,
it was normally reliable.
yeah. And by the way, that's a beautiful way of describing failure. It's not something is bad. It's the absence of the count on it being good thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's what persistence is. It just goes. Generative is even more interesting because generative is it's flowing with an agnostic sense of utility, meaning that when the spring comes out of the ground, the spring doesn't concern itself with whether you're going to bottle the water, whether you're going to irrigate a field, whether you're going to wash a piece of clothing. The spring is indifferent, but still serving. So it's going to keep doing its thing. And what you ultimately elect to do with the thing that is the byproduct of it doing its thing is up to you, but the spring does not concern itself with it. It is merely in service to the ever unfolding reality that happens because of it. But generative is in service to an infinite set of utilities. That's another attribute of the natural order. And the third, infinitely orthogonal, which is the one that I think confuses people by the language, but it doesn't confuse us if we actually sit with it. If we observe the sun, and according to our current cosmology, we're supposed to say that it's 93 million miles away. 180 days from now, we have gone 186 million miles from where we're looking at it. And lo and behold, 186 million miles later, you know what it still looks like? The same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Infinitely orthogonal is no matter how you look at it, its essence cannot change by our perspective. In other words, I may look at a thing, I may see it for its utility in one instance or its utility in another instance, but the same tree that I could turn into heat, I could turn into a table, I could turn into chopsticks, I could turn into anything else. Nothing about my perception of or my interaction with that thing is going to change its essence, because its essence doesn't require perspective. It exists without it, thus infinitely orthogonal. And so these three principles.
It seems like it's related to the generative because.
Well, they're all exactly. They're all related, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
Because the persistence is the is nature of essence won't change.
Yeah.
The generative is whatever you do with it, it doesn't care because it's going to stay it. And the infinite orthogonality means that we are the ones who are defining the phenomenon that we allow the thing to experience, but the reality is not changed by our phenomenology.
The essence remains the same.
Exactly.
So this is where your particular set of talents is extremely interesting, because you can kind of look at a situation and you see things that a lot of people don't.
Yeah.
People don't.
I'll give you my favorite example. And this is by far my favorite example. I was traveling out of Dalin Zadgad in
Where?
Mongolia. Dalin Zadgad, one of the well-known tourist destinations in Mongolia. I'm joking. Nobody knows about it. If you're a copper miner at Oyotogi, you know about it. Otherwise, you have no idea what I'm saying. But I love saying the name of the town, Dalin Zadgad. That's just a fun name. But I was traveling out of Dalin Zadgad and crossing the Gobi Desert. And one of the things that caught my eye literally was what appeared to be close to a half a kilometer to a full kilometer of very reflective glass strewn about the desert. And I asked the person I was traveling with, I said, what's that about? Because I've seen it a bunch of places across Mongolia. And they said, well, that's the landfills, because during the Soviet occupation of Mongolia, the only thing you do in the middle of the winter in Mongolia is you drink vodka, and that's vodka bottles. As far as the eye could see, vodka bottles. Okay. Now stay with me, because this story is fun. Korea, because Korea is known to do this, wanted to do a development project, and, you know, capital D, capital P, right? They wanted to come in and be the white knight and save the poor souls of Mongolia. So they came in and they decided that Mongolia needed greenhouses. One of the things that Koreans apparently didn't do is read all of the history of Mongolia, which is Mongolia is defined by sandstorms and by harsh weather conditions. And what the Koreans did was they built greenhouses, which were plastic covered awnings, which in the very first sandstorm were probably blown into Beijing in tiny fragments. And they left going, well, that's sad. We're going to take all of our development pats on the back, and we're going to tell the world that you can't build greenhouses in Mongolia because they're sandstorms. And I was having this conversation. I said, well, hold on a minute. Isn't it fascinating that everything that we need to build a greenhouse is already here, courtesy of Russian logistics?
The vodka bottles.
And we designed and built the world's first vodka bottle greenhouses in Mongolia.
I saw it coming.
Right? But think about this.
That's great.
All you had to do is realize, and guess what the sandstorms do, Nori? This is the cool thing. What the sandstorms do is they actually glaze the surface of the glass, which increases the absorption property of the glass. So it actually, the sandstorms help make the greenhouse better.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Isn't it amazing that the junk that we decided to call junk, because the Soviets just left it there when they left, the junk wasn't junk. It was infrastructure that was pre-delivered to solve a problem, which said, can we grow fresh vegetables in the desert in Mongolia? And the answer is yes, and courtesy of the Russian occupation. Now, what happened in that story? What happened in that story is we did an integral audit of the essence of the place, right? Rather than seeing it for the absence of what's not there, we actually said, well, hold on a minute, what is there? And what is there is a whole heck of a lot of vodka bottles. And you know what? Vodka bottles are really good glass. They're phenomenally good glass. We then used the exact same vodka bottle designs to build houses in the leprosy communities in Kathmandu. And the fascinating thing is, using the exact same design, we had 2-story buildings that during the great earthquake in Kathmandu a few years ago, because we built them out of bottles, the buildings vibrated but did not fall.
Oh, interesting.
And it turns out that leprosy community buildings were the best built in Kathmandu. How amazing. And that technology we transferred from Mongolia to Kathmandu to build leprosy community villages. And lo and behold, their bottle houses didn't fall in the earthquake. Now, I'm giving you this example because we're not waiting to build heaven on earth. We have its present capacity all the time. What we have to do is realize that we are the architects of the hell we're living in. And if we really want to manifest a different reality, all we have to do is ask 3 questions. Persistent, generative, infinitely orthogonal. How are we looking at the world? And are we looking at it through the lens of scarcity, or are we willing to consider that there is abundance that we are neglecting? And the minute we understand that, we change everything about our lived experience.
That's absolutely fantastic as a cut to the chase.
Yeah, well, and that's but the thing is, I don't like to live in an aspirational space. I like to live and go, hold on a second, this actually makes sense. So why don't I go ahead and try it?
Yeah.
And if I can make a earthquake resistant leprosy community in Kathmandu, there's not a lot else that you can put in front of me and go, well, that's a challenge you can't take on.
So I love your way of looking at things. And, you know, I have also kind of a different way that I came into this world. I remember back to the day I was born, and I knew I had come here to do something. It was very, very strong. And I have, over the years, I've looked for people like you who have these amazing skills and abilities and have done, you know, a whole lot of heavy lifting already. And I just want you to know, I want to play together.
I'm all about it. This is a world in which, you know, I think, Nori, one of the things I'm familiar with in your work, and I think you would find sympathetic to probably my experience in this one very important place, is when you see the possibility that appears to you self-evident, and you see that the reality people are experiencing isn't matching that. Mm-hmm. As a human, as a compassionate, empathic person, your impulse is, I think there's a way I could convince people that maybe there'd be a better way to do this. And so you spend time and effort and you do your very best. And my guess is, like me, you've probably experienced moments where you go, man, did I just translate it wrong? Like, why didn't people get it? Like, what was it about the way I said it, the way I delivered it, whatever it was? There's probably something about me that is the reason why people don't get it.
Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time in a lot of pain around that, because I'd try to be passionate and I'd try to go, look at what's possible. And people would go, I don't see it. And then I would spend time going, well, maybe it's me. Maybe I haven't communicated effectively. Mm-hmm. And then I decided to change my experience, which is just do it.
Yeah.
Just do it. Just live it. And then when people see the byproduct of the just doing it, let them come and ask the question, how did you do that? Because once the artifact of transformation is in front of people, then it's easier to engage the conversation about its provenance. When I'm trying to explain to somebody what their possibility is, and they've never had a view of a world that's produced from that worldview, then guess what? That's actually a problem, because they can't imagine that world. So they're trapped in some of Buckminster Fuller's paradoxes, where you're just sitting there going, you know, you can't imagine a solution that is beyond the scope of possibility in your world. And Einstein was trapped in the same place, and Bucky Fuller was trapped there. And a lot of brilliant minds got trapped in trying to translate between worldviews, and then realizing that it is only in the doing of another methodology that people finally can engage and go, hey, you did an interesting thing. How did you do that?
Yeah, you know, that happened for me with the Best Game on Earth. I had this amazing experience with a Soviet diplomat at the United Nations, and had this big aha that what we need to do, that the game of life that we're currently living is actually is very dysfunctional, because the dysfunction has been handed down generation after generation, and we've made some tweaks, some improvements, but it's still highly dysfunctional. But into this, can we consciously create a new life game that works so well that everyone says, oh, that looks like so much fun, I want to play? So I named it the Best Game on Earth. And I just remember after my book Surviving, The Best Game on Earth came out and was a New York Times bestseller. And I'm going, oh, I was waiting for people to go, wow, this is so cool. Let's play this game. Nothing, cricket.
Yeah.
So then I decided I'd play it. And I just started playing it. It took me, I'm a slow study. It took me 10 years to write the rules of the game, there are 10 of them. And, but I was kicking the tires on every single rule. And over time, people began getting very interested and very curious. And I was invited to give talks. At first I started giving presentations. And then I said, no, it's much more fun if I just tell them the 2 stories that led me to the idea of the game. And then I say, okay, now you know everything I did. How will we go about designing the game?
Yeah.
And those were amazing, alive gatherings where people were brainstorming and you could just see everyone coming alive. And I learned something out of every one of those. And it was just ever so much fun, And now I see the game, what I call the game, breaking out all over the world. And you're certainly a major, incredible player in the game. And as I said, I really look forward to exploring, after the interview. There's some things specifically I'd like to run by you to see if there's a collab. I sent you the piece on the lottery.
Yes.
Did you read it?
Yes.
There's a lot more that's done on that one. Also curious, did you ever meet Buckminster Fuller?
Yes.
Aha, I bet that was a stellar encounter.
Well, many of the individuals who certainly I have leaned on heavily to study in their lives, because I think there is a community of people who have who've probably come in on a similar frequency.
Yeah.
And then at various points have either taken a rather ascetic path, or they have taken a conformity path.
Mm-hmm.
And I find both of them to be unsatisfactory for my own life. I like to engage with people. In fact, it's one of the things that probably lights me up more than I can imagine anything else. So the ascetic thing, there are moments, by the way, where I'm very drawn to it. I think that I'd probably do better in my own thoughts a lot of times, but I love engaging with people. And the consensus one, where you adopt kind of the philosopher professor, where you are, kind of an amusement to the cognoscente, but you're not necessarily effectual. And we can see people like Bertrand Russell, we can see people like Buckminster Fuller, we can see a number of beautiful souls who were relegated to being social philosophers. And the fact is that one of the things I have been very fortunate to do is have the ability to meet in later stages of their lives several of the people who I genuinely find beautiful, luminous souls, and sitting and trying to understand within their own lived experience how they navigated the inflection points where the seduction of either ascetic or kind of consensus philosopher, how they navigated those decision points. Because what I know is I want to do it a different way. And the way I want to do it is very, very individually fascinating from a standpoint of just the discipline, the martial art of it, which is I would love to see the first heroless story written.
Aha. Or how about the everybody's a hero?
Well, no, I actually fundamentally think that there's a lot of people who aren't. I think we have a bunch of people who've been cloned to be consensus. And what I'd love to do, is be in a position where we could genuinely achieve high order transformation, because I have studied the evolution of punctuations in civilization. And what you find is that there is, in fact, a very small group who are always the catalysts. The problem is that many times the catalysts are formed by a very powerful luminous source with essentially a bunch of sycophants around them. And what I think we have a chance to do, and that's why I love this conversation, I think we have a chance to do something where the identity of the hero doesn't exist because there's an us.
Yeah.
And I think that when you look at the us and people go, well, who was the leader? Well, there wasn't really one. And well, who was the person who pulled it? There really wasn't one. Essentially, take much more of a community of persistent approach, which says, can you be capable of doing great things and erasing your footsteps at the same time, so that you're not leaving a path that is emulated, but you're modeling a life that is aspirational?
I'm totally with you on that.
Yeah.
Absolutely, 100%, 1,000,000%.
Yeah.
And in a way, I would see that as what's called referent leadership, where the person who's the appropriate leader for a particular action in a given moment assumes the leadership.
Well, and I had a beautiful conversation years ago. Mustafa Zarhank, who is one of my dearest friends on earth, and was once upon a time an aspiring politician in Egypt before the Arab uprising. But Mustafa and I would have these lovely conversations, and together with Stefan Schubert at the Dubai International Financial Exchange, we would do a roundtable conversation. A couple of them are still on video somewhere, where we would talk about leadership styles between, Judeo-Christian traditions, Islamic traditions, and secular European traditions. And they were fun conversations because we talked about the essence of leadership. But Mustafa was beautiful in saying that in kind of the traditional, more conservative, let's call it Ottoman Islamic influenced view of leadership, leadership was probably more akin to what Cyrus the Great referred to as the means by which, if you are going to be hungry for the reward, you need to be hungrier for the sun. Now, what he meant in that metaphor was that a leader was only defined by the effects of their ability to model the best and brightest behavior. Their mastery of a thing was when they were recognized post facto as the leader. But they weren't aspiring to it. They weren't trying to coerce or cajole a community into followership. What they were was modeling mastery. And by modeling mastery, after the fact, people go, oh, I think he led, or I think she led. But at the moment, you were nothing more than the catalyzing attractor to organize the force that ultimately was what succeeded.
Yeah.
And in the after effect, when people do the postmortem, they go, oh, I think it was probably that person that probably had something to do with it. That in all of our conversations, and Mustafa has branded his LinkedIn identity as a servant leader, in large part giving homage to those conversations where his view is that if we are going to transform our models, we fundamentally have to transform our social architecture so that we don't have this illusion that the person with the loudest voice and the biggest bullhorn is the one who's allegedly leading. Because if you have to coerce somebody or you have to seduce somebody into followership, you're not a leader.
Yeah. So how do you see the changing of the social fabric, and I would add maybe the reward and incentive structure of the economic and monetary system? How would we change things so that we can more generally support people stepping forward and manifesting behavior that serves as a good model for the rest of us, all of us?
Yeah, so several years ago, Larry Stapleton at Waterford Institute asked me to write a paper. It was for one of the societies he was chair of. And so I wrote a paper and he sent it back from his editorial reviews, and he said, it's a beautiful philosophical paper, but it's missing kind of the scientific gravitas. And so, so he said, just work on it a bit more. And so I did another draft and I sent it. He sent it back, and then it dawned on me that what he was waiting for was a formula. He was waiting for Greek symbols and derivatives and all kinds of other cool things. And so I figured, to make this scientific, I was going to put a Greek symbol formula into the paper. And by the way, it worked. That was the last edit I had to do, and it got published.
What was the edit that you made? What was the edit?
Well, that's what I'm getting to. So the edit was my definition of what wealth is.
Okay.
And it's fun. And by the way, the paper is something along the lines of the true cost of the wealth of nations. So it was a play on the illusion that was set in motion by Adam Smith. But I actually unpacked what I've been referring to as this frictional inefficiency scarcity model, which is kind of the catechism that was begotten of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And so my paper, The True Cost of the Wealth of Nations, was actually to unpack the harm that has been done by our kind of explore, colonialize, consume, and dispose kind of linear view of the world. And so in my paper, what I did was define wealth in the following: that wealth is the sum of utilities extracted by the individual across the derivative of the residual options that are left for all other participants. In other words, how can you decrease the layers of inefficiency that are required to have the maximum utility that has not extinguished an option for anyone downstream? And the more wealthy you are, the more experience you have that didn't cost others any of their experience. Now, when I am asked to take the mathematic formula off the board and explain it, I do something very simple. I love the sunrise. And Nori, when I say I love the sunrise, I inappropriately love the sunrise. I am affectionate for the sun. There's nothing more beautiful to me than standing on a mountain or a beach or in my backyard and welcoming the first rays of the sun. Absolutely love it. And what I can tell you is that every day that I absorb that beautiful first light, I am fully satiated in my day. So objectively, I have experienced the wealth of the universe at the beginning of the day. Now, here's where we get anti-thermodynamic. Because if you and I were standing in exactly the same sunrise, my enjoyment of the sunrise would not diminish.
Yeah.
And nothing about my enjoyment would take anything from your enjoyment.
Right.
But here's the thermodynamic magic of the real definition of wealth. By both observing that sunrise together, you having your experience, I having my experience, an anti-thermodynamic matter and energy is in fact created. Because the creation of energy that can happen is the sum of our experience adds to, not in a linear calculation, but in an integral calculation, it adds to the total sum of energy in the universe, because the fact we stood together actually unleashes a polarity energy that did not exist in our individuated state. So why do I use that derivative notion inside of the calculation of wealth? The calculus of wealth is saying I'm more wealthy when I have actually opened up the possibility of you experiencing the full utility of the thing that I just experienced. Because it turns out that when we do that, we actually add energy to the universe. And this is where we come kind of full circle. The definition of wealth has been a hoarding-based scarcity model, which says, can you survive the famine? My definition is to say, we will share in abundance and have no famine. Because we won't. Because objectively, if we are in fact living along a infinitely orthogonal view of an abundant universe, I'll probably have to change my definition of food because I may not have whatever the convenience is at the grocery store. But that doesn't mean I will be lacking for calories. It means I will probably have to learn how to do a better job of husbanding the forest that I live around. I'm going to have to overcome some of my objections to eating certain things. That's fine. But objectively, I'm not going to have a famine because I'm investing in a definition of wealth that says that my wealth is determined by how many seats I have put at the table, not how big my seat is at the table.
Yeah, that's very good. You know, that tags very nicely to the South Sea Islanders, the traditional people's definition or story about heaven and hell.
Yes.
You know the story?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. So why don't you tell it? I've told, because I love this story.
Well, I love it, and I love the fact that what we have is in many instances a variation of the same story in the Confucian tradition. But essentially, there is a world in which we actually are in the business of serving and feeding one another, and that many times the metaphor is about having utensils that don't necessarily shape into our own world, but shape so that we can serve others, and then others serve us back. But interestingly enough, the Confucian variation of the story, which I love, is that hell is if you're never missed when your seat at the table goes empty.
Interesting.
Which I have always loved. I've always loved the metaphor that you are judged by the degree to which your service mattered.
Yeah.
Not to you and not to some sort of ephemeral idea. If people speak of you and go, man, it was lovely to have Dave Martin around, that's heaven. And hell is actually not even being worth being forgotten.
David who?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So let's tie this all together now. And if you were to give a message out into the world to people to encourage this general direction or this embracing of the idea of creating heaven on earth together, and oh boy, how much fun this could be, and let's go for it. What's your message for people?
Well, I think the first thing is we need to move two social assumptions out of our reality. The first is fear doesn't exist. And every derivative of an illusion is also an illusion. So I think we need to really tackle that issue. Because I think that as long as we leave the agency of fear in place, we're going to have problems.
Right.
And so I think the first thing to do is really do the self-examination of life and examine where you are acting out of fear. And a lot of times, I don't think we're very explicit on that, but I think we must be, because you can't move into an abundant universe if you carry with it this kind of little insidious bag that says, well, I'm going to count on you almost. You're either in or you're not. Yeah. And you need to be in, because the universe is in. And, you know, like anything else, if you don't have the capacity for living fearlessly, then we've got a bigger structural problem. The second thing is, I think we need to constantly remind ourselves that we don't live in a linear system.
Right.
And we need to move into not just cyclicality, but we need to move into a recognition that says that the assumptions we've made that the universe, absent our intervention, is entropic, is a giant illusion that is absolutely false. When a tree falls in the forest and actually becomes this soil and the humus and the fertile soil for spores to land on and fungus to grow in and bugs to eat and everything else, it didn't stop being a tree. It actually diversified its essence of tree into nourishment for multiple life forms. And that's a perspective that we miss. because we think that we have a consumption to extinction life, but we don't. We have a stewardship for amplification life. That's what we really have. And so the absence of fear opens up the possibility that you can actually see yourself is being prepared for that which will then benefit from the livingness of your life. And that includes your organic matter. It includes your energy. It includes your life force. It includes everything else. But most of the reform, Nori, for me, and most of what I see in social interactions is a reformation of our mindset that says that as we move away from scarcity to recognition of the objective truth of the abundant universe, the moment we do that, we're emancipated from fear. And as a derivative of that, we actually are also emancipated from the illusion of control. And now we move into a world of stewardship and accountability, which is actually far more attractive than control and scarcity. And I think that where we are as a society is, I think we're at the fledgling edge of the emergence of the recognition that the other model simply is outdated. And if we move into a space of going like anything that is outdated, I'm not rejecting the thing. I'm not dismissing it as having no utility. I'm simply saying it's outmoded.
It's outdated.
And there is a new application of life that actually calls for a new mode. And part of that conversation is this conversation, which is two people who probably on a resonant frequency have occupied here on this beautiful planet this amazing experience of a plurality of cultures and social and personal interactions. And we can find ourselves having traversed very different paths, landing precisely in this moment at exactly the same spot, which is we're birthing what's next.
Yeah. Well, this is wonderful. And if each one of us remembers, remember is connecting with the infinite one.
Yep.
Constantly, as you said, regenerating itself. We do my husband Richard and I do prayers before we eat. And a lot of times just generically, we just feel called to do a prayer. And one of the ones I find myself recently saying is infinite, eternal one, infinitely, eternally creating here, now, everywhere, all the time, beyond time, infinitely creating. Wow. I am of you. We are of you. We have this creative capability ourselves. And when we remember this and we experience this, we become a different being.
No question. And it's similar to a practice that I've engaged when I'm asked to say a blessing around a meal. What I do is I pick one thing on the table and I discuss my personal journey of the provenance of that thing. In other words, acknowledge the hands that planted and trimmed the vine that ultimately gave rise to the grape. Acknowledge the individual vintner who figured out how exactly to ferment the proper yeast with the proper grape, and acknowledge all of the people who actually contributed to one object on the table.
Beautiful.
What I find fascinating about that experience is I usually don't have a dry eye around the table, because when you bring the humanity of the inefficient supply chain that we've become accustomed to, when you bring the humanity of it to your dining table, what you find is that you change your consumption pattern immediately. You realize that you are not consuming calories and molecules and structure. You're actually participating in a flow of life.
Beautiful.
And when you do that, what you do is open up the aperture to realize that as you are participating in a flow, you are part of a flow too. And by bringing that together, I think we can do wonderful things. And something as simple as that, whether it's my discussion of the Komgi who harvest the chocolate that goes into the chocolate mousse, and the story that I will tell in gratitude for their reception of inviting me into their village. Whatever the story is, it doesn't matter what it is, the Himalayan salt, any of the things that are on the table are evocative of a sense of gratitude that says that we can, by recitation of their provenance, connect to the divine.
Yeah, I think that gratitude is such an incredible, important piece. I mean, in the best game on earth, the third rule of those 10 is come from love, respect, and gratitude.
Yeah.
Because I think that when we do come from, and love is the opposite of fear, and respect is acknowledging that the person or the whatever before you is, you are really seeing, in a sense, yourself in them and them in you, and you are all part of this amazing experience of being alive in this amazing generative universe.
Yeah.
And then the gratitude, it's an overwhelming feeling.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. David, I want to thank you so much.